Hi, my name is Maggie Pigg, and I'll be doing my presentation over the labels of Esther. Before we really dive into the research, I would like to give a quick summary of the story of Esther. Esther is a young Jewish woman adopted by her uncle Mordecai after the death of both of her parents. In the state, it was customary for the king to summon the queen whenever he pleased. However, when she was summoned, Queen Vashti, a woman who had been previously chosen by the king because she fit his liking, refused to comply with the king's wishes. The king is not pleased with this and turns to advisors for counsel. One man suggests that Vashti's title as queen be taken from her, and the king choose someone else who will comply. The king then appoints commissioners across the lands of Persia and Media to find a young woman to take on Vashti's role. Upon hearing of this, Esther's adoptive uncle Mordecai brought her to the commission. He immediately liked her and brought her to the king. After a year of cosmetic treatment, Esther, among other women, is presented to the king, and she is chosen to take over the role of queen because king holds Esther in high favor. At this decision, the king throws Esther a banquet. At the banquet, Mordecai overhears palace guards discussing a plan to assassinate the king. Mordecai relays this to Esther, who notifies the king, and the guards are hanged for their plot to kill the king. Relations between Esther, Mordecai, and the king are civil and pleasant even. However, as Mordecai holds strong to his Jewish faith, he does not bow to the king. One of the king's officials, Haman, notices that Mordecai does not bow to the king and is infuriated. He decides that the way to deal with this seeming betrayal is to kill Mordecai and his people, the Jews. As Haman does not specifically communicate to the king that Mordecai will die, the king agrees to fund the destruction of the people that are the Jews. In summation, Esther, in a moment of courage and strategic thinking, prepares a banquet for Haman and the king, in which she makes a plea for the safety of her people. The king eagerly grants her wish and sends Haman to the gallows to be hanged. As a result of Esther's bravery, Mordecai's faith, and the king's affection for Esther, the Jews were saved. The story of Esther is set in Persia during the time of the Purim festival. The Purim festival can be seen as a bit of a time signature, as it was a really big party that was thrown by the king, and it happened every year at the same time. The Book of Esther is often referred to as folklore rather than absolute history by historians and theologians. This often causes them to question the credibility of the book. This is also the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God. Esther was written as a novella, so it is suspected that this is a story that has been passed down from generation to generation. This means that there is no certain author of the book, but rather, as it was being passed down from family to family, it's been shifted and changed. Esther's unusual genre contributes to the questioning of the credibility of the book. According to Beacon, this book is for certain written before 300 BC. The Book of Esther features 5 primary characters. The first of these is the king. He is the reason that we meet Esther in the first place. He gives insight into the balance of power, as he often refers to his council for advice. He also seeks permission before he can make any definite decisions. The second character that we are introduced to is Queen Vashti. She is a woman in this time period that stands up for herself, which was somewhat unusual. From her, we learn a lot about the treatment of women and the expectation that people have for them. Next, we meet Mordecai. He gives us insight into what it means to adopt and take care of the orphans and the widows. He also gives us insight into various Jewish practices and values. Then we are introduced to Esther, the main character and the heroine of this story. She shows us what it is like to be chosen by a king in spite of her many cultural labels. Throughout this presentation, we will explore the labels that were placed on Esther. Finally, we meet Haman. He's a bit of the villain in this story, and he's a part of the king's council. He gives insight into what it is like to be a part of another culture, as opposed to Judaism. Here's a look at a few of the labels that Esther took on throughout this story. Some of them, such as orphan, are seen as negatives, as she is seen as a risk in society. She is at a disadvantage. And some are points of endearment towards Esther, such as her beauty. This is the reason that the king chose her. This is the reason that she is finally loved and desired. As with each of these, we will continue to take a look at what it means to be a woman, a Jew, and a queen during this time period. First, we will look at Esther as an orphan. To be an orphan means that you have no family. And in this day and age, you are considered to be a great risk of the community. Throughout the Old Testament, we are tasked with taking care of the orphans and the widows. This was Esther. She was an orphan. The responsibility of taking care of the orphans often fell to the king, according to the Oxford Companion. Failure to do so reflects badly on the king and on God. And in this day and age, that was absolutely unacceptable, as everything that they did was in order to glorify God. This is interesting because throughout the story we see this kind of bond between the king and Mordecai. And before Mordecai even really is introduced to the king, he's doing him a great service by adopting Esther. Adoption was not a simple thing in this day and age, and it's not now. And Mordecai took Esther in and took care of her. Another interesting aspect of this story that author Adam Clarke brings up in his commentary is that Agagites, who were Haman's people, pride themselves on the number of children that they have. So it's interesting that Haman is chasing after Esther's people, as Esther is an orphan, and Mordecai has taken her in, and that's something in Haman's culture to be proud of, that you would have an extra child, that you would have more than the average amount. It's almost as if this is just another aspect that Haman feels threatened by Mordecai. The next label of Esther is her beauty. Esther was beautiful, and this was why the king chose her. Outwardly, she was beautiful, but also her internal wisdom was beautiful. This is evident as the story goes on, and Esther makes a cunning plot to save her people. In a commentary by Beacon, it says that her beauty won her safety. And this is absolutely so true, as because Esther was beautiful, the king desired her company. And then she was safe, and she was cared for and provided for. An important thing to note when discussing beauty in this time period is that head coverings were customary, as hair played a large role in beauty. So when Esther appeared before the king, it wasn't so much of the conventional beauty that we think of today, but rather the focus was on a different set of features. Although Esther's beauty is what drew the king's attention to her originally, it was her wisdom and wit that won the king's heart in the end. One of the more obvious labels that Esther has throughout this story is that she is a woman. A woman's role in this time period is drastically different than the role that women play in society today. A woman was supposed to be submissive, and they were seen as a responsibility of the men, and a bit of a commodity to the king. This is why Vashti was so immediately dismissed when she refused to appear before the king. We see evidence of women being a responsibility of the men in Esther's relationship to Mordecai. Mordecai takes on Esther as a responsibility in that he cares for her when there is no one else to care for her. This is why Esther's bravery that we see her display throughout the story is such a big deal, because she stepped out of the role of submission that is generally placed upon women during this time period and was bold for the things that she believed in, even though it was seen as risking her life. It makes the risks that Esther took for her people that much greater, as the opinions of women and the speaking out of women was not something that was common, but rather it was a rare occasion, and it was something that was bold and that was new to this time period. One label, arguably the label that brings about the most conflict throughout the story, is that Esther was a Jew. From Esther being a Jew, and because her family was of Jewish descent, we get insight into the mourning habits of Jews in Mordecai's mourning. For Jews in this time period, mourning was something that was done quite loudly, quite boldly, in public, and they would take off their clothes and put on sackcloth and wear ashes. This was just kind of a sign of their dismay, the pain and the suffering that they were feeling. This story displays the strong ties that we see within the Jewish community, as even though Esther wasn't personally in relationship with many of the people in the Jewish community, because they were her people, she was willing to sacrifice her life for them. Within this Jewish community, Esther was still looked down on because she was an orphan. But at this point in the story, we see Esther go from being a risk to diminishing one, and saving a people that once looked at her and called her unworthy. Finally, we see Esther step into the role of a queen. Finally, Esther is seen as someone who is loved and desired. However, although the glamour is inferred from the title, in many of the commentaries that I came across, it said that even the mother of the king has more power than the queen. So Esther, although she finally had this title that infers glamour and infers some kind of power, she really was powerless, and she was an asset of the king. She was something that he owned, his property, to appear before him and his friends upon request. Esther's role as queen is purely to appear before the king only by request. This is where Esther's courage plays a role in the story, because she appears before the king outside of his request, which is a really, really big deal. We also have learned that the role of a queen was to host the women and the servants in a separate house. So they weren't even allowed to eat in the same house as the king, which is interesting because a king and a queen are often thought of to be married. But it wasn't even so much as an equal partnership as we now think of marriage, but it was more of the king owning the queen. In conclusion, we have a lot to learn from the story of Esther, both about the time period and the customs and the culture, but also about the bravery and the courage of Esther and how her story shaped the role of women in society today. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.